The blood on Eleanor Dalton's dress told a story that her trembling voice could not. She stood in the doorway of Silver Creek's only saloon, her golden hair matted with dust and her blue eyes wild with desperation. The piano player's fingers froze on the keys, and the murmur of conversation died as every patron turned to stare at the young widow who had just staggered in from the unforgiving Arizona desert. Eleanor had ridden 20 miles through scorching heat, her skin now burned red from the merciless sun of 1878. She clutched a locket to her chest, swaying slightly as she fought to remain upright. "My husband's still out there," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the sudden silence. A tall figure rose from a corner table, spurs jingling against wooden floorboards. Yates Hawkins adjusted his weathered Stetson, revealing piercing green eyes that had seen their share of trouble across the untamed frontier. The cowboy's hand rested casually on his holstered Colt as he approached the trembling woman. "Then he'll answer to me," he said, his voice steady as stone. The saloon owner, Luther Briggs, quickly poured a glass of water and pressed it into Eleanor's shaking hands. "Miss, you better sit down before you fall down." Eleanor's eyes never left the cowboy's face. "They ambushed us at Rattlesnake Gulch, my husband James. He told me to ride for help while he held them off." Her voice broke. "3 men. They wanted our wagon, our supplies, everything." Yates Hawkins nodded once, understanding immediately what was at stake. In this harsh territory, a man left wounded in the desert wouldn't survive long against the elements or the vultures, both avian and human. "How long ago?" he asked, already mentally calculating distances and possibilities. 4 hours, maybe 5, Eleanor answered, struggling to maintain her composure. "I got lost twice trying to find my way here." The cowboy turned to the bartender. "Sam, I need supplies, water, bandages, ammunition." Then to a grizzled man by the window. "Doc Matthews, we might need your services when we return." The town doctor nodded grimly. "I'll prepare my instruments." Yates returned his attention to Eleanor. "Madam, I need you to describe exactly where you left your husband and what these men looked like." Eleanor closed her eyes, summoning the terrible scene. "We were following the old mining trail when they appeared from behind the red rock formation. One had a scar across his face like a lightning bolt. Another wore a black duster despite the heat. The third was short with a red bandana." Her voice caught. "James is wearing a blue shirt. He has dark hair and a beard. We were married just 3 weeks ago in Boston before heading west." Something flickered in Yates's eyes recognition. "The Garrett gang. They've been terrorizing travelers along that route for months." Luther Briggs spat on the floor. "Vultures, the lot of them. Can you take me to him?" Eleanor pleaded, attempting to stand. Yates gently pressed her back into the chair. "You're in no condition to ride back out there, madam. I'll go along with whoever's willing." 3 men immediately stood up from their tables, a testament to the code that still existed even in these lawless territories. "Madam," Yates said, his voice softening slightly, "I give you my word that if your husband is alive, I'll bring him back to you." Eleanor grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "And if he's not," the cowboy's jaw tightened, "then justice will find those responsible." He removed her hand gently. "Luther, see that Mrs. Dalton," Eleanor supplied. "Eleanor Dalton, see that Mrs. Dalton gets a room and something to eat." "We'll ride out immediately." As the men gathered their weapons and supplies, Eleanor watched the cowboy with a mixture of hope and fear. There was something in his eyes, a haunted quality that spoke of personal loss, of battles fought and sometimes lost. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked quietly as he checked his rifle. Yates paused, his expression unreadable. "Out here, madam, we're all one bad day away from needing help ourselves." He tipped his hat and strode out the door, the other volunteers following in his wake. Eleanor collapsed into the chair, the adrenaline that had kept her going finally giving way to exhaustion. As Luther guided her upstairs to a room, she clutched her wedding ring, whispering a prayer to whatever God might be listening in this God-forsaken wilderness. The search party thundered across the desert, guided by Eleanor's descriptions and Yates's intimate knowledge of the territory. The cowboy rode slightly ahead of the others, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. "You think the husband's still alive?" asked Ben Miller, a cattle rancher who'd volunteered despite barely knowing the Hawkins man. Depends on how badly they wanted what he had, Yates replied grimly. The Garrett gang isn't known for leaving witnesses. They rode in silence for another hour, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. The landscape was beautiful in its desolation, red rock formations standing like ancient sentinels against the vast blue sky. There, Yates pointed to vultures circling in the distance. The men spurred their horses forward, dread settling in their guts. The wagon came into view first, its contents ransacked, supplies scattered across the sand. Blood stained the wooden frame, telling a grim story of violence. Spread out, Yates ordered. Look for tracks, signs of where they might have gone. They dismounted, weapons ready as they approached the scene. Behind an outcropping of rocks, they found a body not James Dalton, but one of the attackers. His red bandana was now dark with dried blood, a bullet hole centered neatly in his chest. Husband got one of them at least, muttered Frank Thompson, the blacksmith who had joined their party. Yates knelt beside the body, examining it with experienced eyes. Shots too precise for a man in panic. Mr. Dalton might be more capable than his wife realizes. They continued searching the area, following a trail of blood droplets that led away from the wagon. The tracks told a story. 3 men had approached from the north. There had been a firefight, and then 2 sets of prints headed east, one stumbling and irregular. They're taking him somewhere, Yates concluded, standing from his crouched position. Probably to finish him off where his screams won't attract attention. The men remounted their horses, following the tracks with renewed urgency. As they rode, Yates couldn't help but think of Eleanor Dalton's face, the mingled fear and determination, the wedding ring still shiny on her finger. 3 weeks married, just starting a life together only to have it threatened by the lawlessness that defined these territories. The tracks led them to a narrow canyon as darkness began to fall. Yates signaled for the men to halt and dismount. We go on foot from here, he whispered. They'll have a lookout. The 4 men moved silently through the gathering shadows, guns drawn. The sound of laughter echoed against the canyon walls, followed by a pained groan that confirmed their suspicions James Dalton was still alive. Yates peered around a boulder to assess the situation. 2 men sat by a small fire, one with a lightning-shaped scar across his face, the other in a black duster. Between them, a man sat slumped against a rock, his hands bound before him, his blue shirt darkened with blood from a wound in his shoulder. His face was bruised, but his eyes were alert, watching his captors with calculated intensity. That's James Dalton, Yates whispered to the others. The Garrett brothers have him. Scarface is Wade, the older one, the other is Caleb. What's the plan? Ben asked, checking his ammunition. Ben, you and Frank circle around to the east side of their camp. Tom and I will approach from here. When you hear my signal, show yourselves but hold your fire until I give the word. We want Dalton out alive if possible. The men nodded and separated. Yates and Tom crept closer, using the rocks as cover. They were close enough now to hear the conversation. Your wife's probably dead in the desert by now, Wade Garrett was saying, poking at James with the barrel of his gun. No one survives that ride to Silver Creek in this heat, especially not some Eastern lady. Despite his injuries, James Dalton's voice was steady. You don't know my wife, Wade laughed. Well, if she did make it, ain't no one coming back for you. Folks in these parts know better than to cross the Garretts. You killed my brother, Caleb added, his voice tight with anger. Seems only fair we take our time with you. James met his gaze unflinchingly. Your brother tried to murder me and assault my wife. I'd shoot him again if I had the chance. Caleb lunged forward, striking James across the face with his gun. You'll die slow for that. Yates had heard enough. He fired a shot into the air, the signal, and stepped into the clearing, his rifle aimed squarely at Wade's chest. Evening, gentlemen, he said calmly. Seems you've taken something that doesn't belong to you. The Garrett brothers froze, then slowly turned to face him. Wade's hand hovered near his holster. Hawkins, he spat. This ain't your business. I'm making it my business, Yates replied as Ben and Frank appeared on the opposite side of the camp, their weapons trained on the outlaws. The man's wife rode all the way to Silver Creek, asked for help. We're obliging. Wade's eyes darted between the four armed men, calculating his odds. You know who we are, you know what happens to folks who cross us. And you know who I am, Yates countered. So you understand I'm not bluffing when I say drop your weapons or join your brother in hell. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then with a curse, Wade slowly removed his gun belt and tossed it aside. Caleb, after a furious glance at his brother, did the same. Tie them up, Yates ordered, keeping his rifle trained on the brothers as Tom and Frank secured their hands. Yates approached James Dalton, kneeling beside him. Your wife sent us, Eleanor, she made it to Silver Creek. Relief washed over James's battered face. She's alive, she's safe? Yes to both, Yates confirmed, cutting the ropes binding James's wrists. Doc Matthews is waiting back in town. Can you ride? James nodded grimly. Get me on a horse. I'll manage. They helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he stumbled. The shoulder wound had bled extensively, but the bullet appeared to have passed through cleanly. What about them? Ben asked, nodding toward the Garrett brothers. We'll take them to Sheriff Taylor in Silver Creek, Yates said. Let the law handle it properly, Wade sneered. The law out here, don't make me laugh, Hawkins. You know as well as I do that jail can't hold us. Yates turned to face the outlaw, his expression hardening. Maybe not. But Eleanor Dalton deserves to see justice done the right way. And if you ever break free, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Wade could hear, I'll be waiting. And next time there won't be any talk of jail. They made camp that night, unable to risk the treacherous terrain in darkness. James Dalton slipped in and out of consciousness as Frank, who had some medical experience, cleaned and bandaged his wound as best he could. He's strong, Frank observed. Most men would have succumbed to a wound like this hours ago, especially after the beating he took. Yates nodded, keeping one eye on their prisoners. His wife's the same way, rode 20 miles through desert heat, half dead when she reached town but still standing. Makes you wonder what kind of life they had back east that prepared them for this, Tom mused. As if hearing their conversation through his pain-induced haze, James stirred. Boston, he murmured. Father was a doctor, taught me. Eleanor's father was a ship's captain. Taught her to navigate by stars. Yates offered him water. Rest now, we'll get you back to her tomorrow. James gripped his arm with surprising strength. Thank you, I don't even know your name. Yates Hawkins. I owe you my life, Mr. Hawkins. Yates shook his head. You owe your life to your wife and her determination. I'm just the instrument of her will. The next morning, they fashioned a travois for James, who was too weak to sit a horse for the journey back. The Garrett brothers were securely bound to their saddles, their horses' reins tied to those of their captors. The return journey was slower but mercifully uneventful. As the buildings of Silver Creek appeared on the horizon, Yates noticed James struggling to sit up despite his injuries. Easy, he cautioned. You've lost a lot of blood. I want to ride in, James insisted. I want Eleanor to see me sitting tall, not laid out like a corpse. Yates studied him for a moment, then nodded. With Tom's help, they carefully transferred James to Yates's horse, mounting him in front of the cowboy who could support him if needed. She's a remarkable woman, your wife, Yates said as they approached the town. James smiled weakly. That she is. I knew it the moment I met her. Standing on her father's ship in Boston Harbor, giving orders to men twice her size who respected her too much to question her. What brings you out west? Not many Easterners choose this life willingly. Land, opportunity, a chance to build something that's ours alone. James winced as pain shot through his shoulder. Eleanor's father left her some money when he died, enough to start fresh somewhere new. We decided on Arizona because few had claimed it yet. It's beautiful country, Yates acknowledged, but unforgiving to those who don't respect it. We're learning that lesson, James paused. What about you, Mr. Hawkins? You don't strike me as someone born to this territory. Yates was silent for a moment. No, I came west after the war. Some men couldn't leave the fighting behind when the surrender was signed. I was one of them. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. As they entered Silver Creek, townspeople emerged from buildings to witness their return. Word had spread quickly about Eleanor's arrival and the search party's mission. Eleanor herself burst from the hotel, having been watching anxiously from its windows. She ran down the street, heedless of propriety, her focus entirely on the approaching riders. When she saw James, alive and upright on the horse, she let out a cry that was half sob, half laughter. As they halted, Yates helped James dismount carefully, supporting him until Eleanor reached them and took her husband into her arms. "You came back to me," she whispered against his neck, mindful of his injuries yet unable to stop herself from holding him close. "I told you I would," James replied, his voice stronger in her presence. "Always." Yates stepped back, allowing the couple their reunion as Doc Matthews approached with his medical bag. The sheriff took custody of the Garrett brothers, marching them toward the jailhouse with stern warnings about their future. Later that evening, after James had been treated and settled into a room at the hotel, Yates sat alone at the saloon, nursing a whiskey. He hadn't planned to stay in Silver Creek beyond delivering James to safety, but something kept him from riding out immediately. Perhaps it was the unfinished nature of the situation. The Garretts were dangerous men with dangerous connections. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion. Or perhaps, he admitted to himself, it was Eleanor Dalton's eyes when she had thanked him filled with a gratitude so profound it had made him uncomfortable. He wasn't accustomed to being looked at that way, Mr. Hawkins. He turned to find Eleanor standing beside his table, composed and dignified despite the ordeal of the past 2 days. She wore a simple dress now, her hair neatly arranged, though fatigue still lined her face. "Mrs. Dalton," he acknowledged, rising to his feet, "how is your husband?" "Resting comfortably. The doctor says the wound is clean and should heal well with time and care." She hesitated. "May I join you? There are things I wish to say." He gestured to the chair across from him, signaling to the bartender for another glass. "I've thanked you," Eleanor said once seated, "but words seem insufficient for what you've done." Yates shook his head. "Anyone would have helped." "No," she said firmly, "not anyone, not in this world. I've learned that much already." She accepted the glass of whiskey the bartender brought, taking a small sip that made her eyes water. "James told me what you did, how you confronted those men without hesitation, how you cared for him on the journey back." "Your husband is a brave man," Yates replied. "He killed one of his attackers despite being outnumbered, kept his wits about him even when wounded." Eleanor smiled slightly. "We've both had to be braver than we expected when we left Boston." She studied him over the rim of her glass. "James also mentioned you were a soldier." Yates tensed imperceptibly. "A lifetime ago, my brother fought as well. He never came home." She said it simply, without dramatic flourish, but the pain was evident in her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." "Which side?" she asked quietly. He met her gaze directly. "Union." "2nd Massachusetts Cavalry," she nodded. "My brother as well, though with the 20th Maine." They sat in silence for a moment, the shared understanding of war's toll creating an unexpected connection between them. "What will happen to the men who attacked us?" Eleanor finally asked. "The sheriff has them locked up. There will be a trial, though justice moves differently out here than in the East. And if they escape, James says they have friends in these parts." Yates's expression hardened slightly. "Then they'll answer to me." Eleanor studied him, sensing there was more to this man than his taciturn exterior suggested. "You're not just passing through Silver Creek, are you, Mr. Hawkins?" "I go where I'm needed, Mrs. Dalton." "And right now you're needed here." Her perception was uncomfortably accurate. He didn't respond directly. "Where will you and your husband go once he's recovered?" "Back east." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "No, we came west for a purpose. James purchased land near Pleasant Valley, about 40 miles from here. We intend to build a ranch." Yates couldn't hide his surprise. "That's ambitious for newcomers." "We've never lacked ambition, Mr. Hawkins," she said with a small smile. "Only experience, which we're rapidly acquiring." "Pleasant Valley is beautiful country," he acknowledged, "but it's also contested territory. The sheep ranchers and cattle barons have been at each other's throats for years. So we've heard. We plan to raise horses, not take sides in their feuds." Yates almost smiled at her optimism. Madam, neutrality is rarely an option in conflicts like those. Then we'll have to be persuasive, she replied with surprising steel in her voice. James was a lawyer before we came west. He knows how to navigate difficult situations. A doctor's son who became a lawyer, now a rancher, Yates mused. Your husband is a man of many talents. As I suspect are you, Mr. Hawkins, Eleanor countered. She finished her whiskey and stood. I should return to James. The doctor gave him laudanum for the pain, but he'll be looking for me when he wakes. Yates rose as well. Of course. Eleanor extended her hand. Thank you again, Mr. Hawkins. If you ever find yourself near Pleasant Valley, you'll always have a place at our table. He took her hand briefly. Safe journey when you go, Mrs. Dalton. As she walked away, Yates signaled for another whiskey, his mind turning over the conversation. The Daltons were good people, intelligent, determined, and clearly devoted to each other. But they were also naive about the realities of frontier life, especially in a place as volatile as Pleasant Valley. He had no intention of following them there. His path led elsewhere, always moving, never settling. That had been his way since the war ended, and he saw no reason to change it now. Yet, as he drank his whiskey, Yates couldn't shake the feeling that his path and the Daltons might cross again someday. And when that day came, he suspected they might need his help once more. 6 weeks later, Yates rode into Pleasant Valley with a string of horses he'd purchased in Tucson. The summer heat had given way to the milder temperatures of early autumn, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. He told himself he was simply passing through on his way north, that stopping to check on the Daltons was a courtesy, nothing more. The truth was more complicated. News had reached him in Tucson that the Garrett brothers had indeed escaped from the Silver Creek jail 3 weeks after their capture. They had killed a deputy in the process and disappeared into the territories. The sheriff had sent word to neighboring towns to be on alert, but Yates knew the law's reach was limited in these vast spaces. He'd been drifting ever since, taking odd jobs, breaking horses, sometimes hiring his gun to those who needed protection. But his thoughts had frequently returned to Eleanor and James Dalton, wondering if they had established their ranch, if they were safe, if the Garretts had tracked them down for revenge. The directions Eleanor had given him led to a property nestled against the foothills of the mountains, with a creek running through its western edge. As he approached, Yates saw evidence of hard work: a modest but sturdy cabin, a corral containing several horses, the beginnings of a barn under construction. A figure straightened from working on the barn framed James Dalton, his arm no longer in a sling, his face tanned from weeks under the Arizona sun. He shaded his eyes, then raised a hand in greeting as he recognized the approaching rider, Mr. Hawkins. He called, setting down his tools and striding toward the fence line. What brings you to our humble establishment? Yates dismounted, leading his string of horses. Passing through, thought I'd see how you and Mrs. Dalton were faring. James grinned, extending his hand. As you can see, we're building our empire one fence post at a time. His grip was firm, his eyes clear and healthy. Eleanor will be delighted to see you. She's just gone to fetch water from the creek. As if summoned by her name, Eleanor appeared around the side of the cabin, carrying 2 buckets of water. She wore a practical divided riding skirt and a man's shirt with the sleeves rolled up, her hair braided and pinned atop her head. When she spotted Yates, she set the buckets down carefully and hurried over, her face lighting with genuine pleasure. Mr. Hawkins, what a wonderful surprise. She reached them slightly breathless. We've hoped you might visit someday. Madam, he greeted her with a tip of his hat. You both look well. Life agrees with us here, she replied, glancing around their property with evident pride, though it's constant work. I can see that, Yates nodded toward the half-built barn, making good progress. Slower than I'd like, James admitted, but we're learning as we go. Those are fine horses you have there. Just purchased them in Tucson, planning to sell most of them in Prescott. Eleanor's eyes lit up. You're a horse trader, among other things. James glanced at the son's position. It's nearly supper time. You must stay and eat with us, Mr. Hawkins. We insist. Yates hesitated only briefly before accepting. Much obliged, they settled his horses in the corral, providing them with water and feed. As they worked, James asked questions about horse breeding and training, clearly eager to learn from someone with experience. "We've purchased 6 mares so far," he explained. "And that bay stallion you see there, Eleanor's father left her enough to make a proper start, but we're being cautious with our investments." "Wise approach," Yates approved. "That stallion has good lines, strong chest, clean legs." Eleanor called them to supper as the sun began to set. The cabin's interior was simple but homey, with handmade furniture and cheerful curtains at the windows. A bookshelf held volumes that seemed out of place in a frontier home: legal texts, medical references, and literature classics. The meal was simple but hearty: venison stew, fresh bread, and vegetables from a small garden Eleanor had started. As they ate, the Daltons shared stories of their first weeks on the ranch, the challenges they'd faced, the neighbors they'd met, the skills they were acquiring. "How are things in Silver Creek?" James eventually asked. "Have you been back recently?" Yates set down his fork. "I have. That's partly why I wanted to check on you both." He met their gazes directly. "The Garrett brothers escaped jail 3 weeks ago, killed Deputy Wilson in the process." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth while James's expression hardened. "Any sign of them since?" James asked. "None. They could be anywhere in the territory by now, or in Mexico, or here in Pleasant Valley," Eleanor said quietly. "Looking for us." "It's possible," Yates acknowledged. "The Garretts aren't known for forgetting grudges." James reached across the table to take his wife's hand. "We've discussed this possibility, Eleanor. We agreed we wouldn't live in fear." She squeezed his hand. "I know, and we won't." She turned to Yates. "We've made friends here, Mr. Hawkins. The Morrisons to the north, the Tanners to the east. They've been kind, helping us learn the ways of ranching." "Good neighbors are invaluable," Yates agreed, "but be cautious. The Pleasant Valley feud runs deep, and newcomers are often pressured to take sides." James nodded. "We've already experienced some of that. A man named Graham Jenkins stopped by last week, owns the largest cattle operation in the area. Made it clear he expected us to support the cattle interests if it comes to another confrontation with the sheep ranchers." "And what did you tell him?" Yates asked, curious. "That we came here to raise horses, not to fight other people's battles." James's jaw tightened. He wasn't pleased, but he left peacefully enough. Yates considered this information. Jenkins had a reputation as a hard man who didn't take rejection well. "Watch yourselves around Jenkins and his men. They've been known to use intimidation to get what they want." After supper, Eleanor excused herself to tend to the horses, insisting that James remain at the table to rest his still healing shoulder. When she had gone, James leaned forward. "I haven't told Eleanor everything about Jenkins's visit," he said in a low voice. "He made thinly veiled threats about accidents that befall those who don't cooperate in Pleasant Valley." Yates wasn't surprised. "Did he threaten Eleanor specifically?" "Not in so many words." But the implication was clear. James ran a hand through his hair. "I'm concerned, Mr. Hawkins. I can defend myself reasonably well, but if anything happened to Eleanor—" "Your wife is stronger than you give her credit for," Yates observed. "She rode through desert heat to save your life." "Don't underestimate her." "I don't," James said quickly, "but I also won't risk her safety because of my principles." He hesitated. "How long will you be in the area, Mr. Hawkins?" Yates understood the unspoken question. "I plan to continue north tomorrow, but plans can change." Relief flickered across James's face. "We have a spare room. Small but comfortable. You'd be welcome to stay as long as you like. I could use help with the barn, and I'd pay a fair wage." "I'm not looking for charity work, Mr. Dalton. Nor am I offering it. I'm proposing a business arrangement that benefits us both." James leaned back. "You know horses better than I do. I need to learn quickly if this ranch is to succeed, and frankly, having someone with your particular skills around might discourage unwelcome visitors." Yates considered the offer. He had planned to sell the horses in Prescott and then continue his nomadic existence. But something about the Daltons' determination, their refusal to be driven away from their dream, resonated with him. 2 weeks, he finally said. "I'll help with the barn and your horses." After that, I'll need to move on, James smiled, extending his hand. 2 weeks it is. When Eleanor returned, they informed her of the arrangement. Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. Wonderful, you can have the small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it'll be fine, madam, Yates assured her. I've slept under the stars more often than under a roof these past years. Later, as Yates settled into the small but clean room, he found himself wondering about the decision he'd just made. 2 weeks wasn't a significant commitment, but it was more permanence than he'd allowed himself since the war. Something about the Daltons made him want to help them succeed, perhaps, because they represented a hopefulness, a belief in new beginnings, that he had long ago abandoned for himself. Or perhaps, he admitted as he drifted towards sleep, it was the memory of Eleanor Dalton standing in that Silver Creek saloon, bloody but unbowed, her voice breaking as she whispered, "My husband's still out there." A love that fierce was rare in this world. It deserved a chance to flourish. The 2 weeks Yates had promised stretched into 3, then a month. The barn was completed ahead of schedule, thanks to his experience and the willing help of neighboring ranchers who responded to Eleanor's invitations of Sunday suppers and James's legal assistance with property disputes. October brought cooler temperatures and spectacular sunsets that painted the valley in hues of orange and purple. Yates found himself settling into a routine that felt almost like belonging, rising at dawn to work with the horses, teaching James the finer points of breeding and training, discussing books with Eleanor in the evenings as they sat on the porch watching nightfall. He had sold most of his Tucson horses to local ranchers, keeping only 2 for himself, a spirited black stallion named Midnight and a steady roan gelding he used for everyday riding. With the proceeds, he purchased supplies for the Daltons' ranch and invested in a promising filly that would complement their breeding program. The threat from the Garretts remained a shadow at the edges of their awareness. Twice, riders had been spotted watching the ranch from distant ridgelines, only to disappear when approached. Yates had increased his vigilance, teaching both James and Eleanor to shoot with greater accuracy and insisting they never work alone in the far pastures. Eleanor proved to be a quick study with firearms, her determination outweighing her initial discomfort. In Boston, ladies weren't expected to handle guns, she explained one afternoon as they practiced with tin cans set on fence posts. But I'm not in Boston anymore, am I? No, madam, you certainly aren't, Yates replied, adjusting her stance slightly. Keep both eyes open when you aim, she fired, hitting the can squarely and sending it flying. Her face lit up with satisfaction. I believe I'm getting the hang of this, Mr. Hawkins. He nodded his approval. You've got a natural steadiness, important for a good shot. Eleanor lowered the rifle, studying him with those perceptive eyes that sometimes saw more than he intended to reveal. You still haven't told us much about yourself, you know. A month living under our roof and you remain something of a mystery. Yates reloaded his own weapon, buying time. Not much to tell that's worth hearing, Mrs. Dalton. I disagree, she said gently. A man doesn't acquire your skills and knowledge without a story behind them. He sighed, recognizing her quiet persistence. Massachusetts born and raised, fought 4 years in the war, came west afterward because the East felt confining, and your family, gone. Father died before the war, mother during, no siblings. Eleanor's expression softened with compassion, but thankfully without pity. So you've been alone a long time. I prefer it that way, he said, more sharply than intended, then moderating his tone. Simpler? Simpler, perhaps, she acknowledged, but is it better? Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the road to the ranch, Graham Jenkins and 2 of his men, their expressions grim as they approached. Yates subtly moved to stand slightly in front of Eleanor, his rifle held casually but ready. Mr. Jenkins, he called as the men halted their horses at the fence line. What brings you to Dalton Ranch? Jenkins, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and cold eyes, focused on Eleanor rather than Yates. Mrs. Dalton, is your husband available? He's in town today, Eleanor replied evenly. Picking up supplies, I expect him back shortly. Jenkins dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. Then perhaps you and I can have a conversation in his absence about neighborly cooperation. I believe my husband made our position clear during your last visit, Mr. Jenkins, Eleanor said, her chin lifting slightly. We haven't changed our minds. Jenkins's expression darkened. Maybe not yet, but circumstances are changing in Pleasant Valley, Mrs. Dalton. The sheepmen are moving herds onto traditional cattle grazing land. Blood will be spilled before this is over. Not our blood, Yates interjected, not our fight. Jenkins turned his attention to the cowboy, sizing him up with a calculating gaze. Hawkins, isn't it? Heard you were staying on. Interesting choice for a man with your reputation. My reputation, Jenkins smiled thinly. Word travels. They say you rode with Sherman's bummers during the war, that you've hired out your gun more than once since coming west. Yates didn't confirm or deny the accusation. What's your point, Jenkins? My point is that you understand how things work out here, how sometimes lines must be drawn and sides chosen. He turned back to Eleanor. 3 of my calves were slaughtered last week, throats cut, left to rot, sheepmen sending a message. That's terrible, Eleanor said sincerely, but it doesn't change our position. Next time it might not be calves, Jenkins said, his voice hardening. Next time it might be horses or people. Yates took a step forward. Is that a threat, Jenkins? An observation. Neutrality is a luxury, Mrs. Dalton, when you can't afford in Pleasant Valley. Jenkins walked back to his horse. Think about it, talk to your husband, I'll be back in a week for your answer. As they rode away, Eleanor let out a long breath. That man frightens me more than the Garretts, she admitted. At least with them, the danger is straightforward. Yates nodded grimly. Jenkins is dangerous because he believes he's right, that his cause justifies any action. He glanced at her. We should head back to the house. I don't like you being exposed out here after that visit. As they walked back, Eleanor broke the silence. You didn't deny what he said about your past. Yates kept his eyes on the horizon. Some of it's true enough. Which parts? He sighed. Yes, I rode with Sherman. Yes, I've hired my gun out since coming west, but only to protect, never to murder. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for your honesty. After a pause, she added, whatever you did during the war, it was war. Different rules apply. Do they? He asked quietly. Or do we just tell ourselves that to sleep at night? She stopped, turning to face him fully. Yates. It was the first time she had used his given name. We all carry burdens from our past. The question is whether we let them define our future. Something in her words, or perhaps in the way she said them, with such genuine concern pierced the armor he had built around himself over the years. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different kind of life than the solitary existence he had accepted as his fate. The moment passed quickly, buried beneath years of practiced detachment. But it had been there, and they both knew it. We should get back, he said gruffly. James will be returning soon. That evening, after James returned and was informed of Jenkins's visit, the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table discussing their options. We could sell, James suggested reluctantly. Move further north, away from the Pleasant Valley conflict. Eleanor shook her head firmly. We've put too much of ourselves into this place. I won't be driven away by threats. Then we need allies, James said. The Morrisons and Tanners are friendly, but they're small ranchers like us. If Jenkins decides to move against us, they won't be enough. Yates, who had been silent during their exchange, finally spoke. There's another option, play for time. They both looked at him questioningly. Tell Jenkins what he wants to hear, Yates elaborated. Say you'll support the cattle interests if it comes to open conflict. But make it conditional on them providing protection against threats like the Garretts. You're suggesting we lie? Eleanor asked, surprised. I'm suggesting you survive, Yates replied bluntly. Jenkins won't care about your support until the conflict escalates, which might not happen for months. By then, you'll be more established with more connections in the community. James considered this. It goes against my principles to make promises I don't intend to keep. Then don't make promises, Yates countered. Be vague. Tell Jenkins you're reconsidering your position. That you understand his concerns. Give him enough to make him think he's winning you over. Eleanor and James exchanged glances, communicating silently in the way that only people who deeply understand each other can do. It could buy us time, Eleanor acknowledged. And frankly, I'm more concerned about the Garretts than Jenkins at this point, James sighed. Very well. When Jenkins returns, I'll indicate that we're open to discussing cooperation, but I won't explicitly promise to take his side in any violence. Yates nodded, satisfied with the compromise. Fair enough. Later that night, after the Daltons had retired to their bedroom, Yates sat on the porch cleaning his guns by lamplight. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky like diamonds on black velvet. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound echoing across the valley. The door opened behind him and Eleanor stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. May I join you? She asked softly. He nodded, making room for her on the bench. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, listening to the night sounds. James is worried about Jenkins, she finally said. More than he lets on to me. He's right to be concerned, Yates replied honestly. Jenkins isn't a man who tolerates defiance. Eleanor tucked her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. When we left Boston, we knew there would be dangers, but we thought they would be natural ones: drought, harsh winters, illness. We didn't anticipate becoming caught in the crossfire of other people's conflicts. That's the West for you, Yates said with a hint of irony. Everyone fighting over land that belonged to someone else first. She turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful in the lamplight. You're planning to leave soon, aren't you? The question caught him off guard. What makes you say that? I've seen you watching the horizon more often, checking your gear in the evenings. The signs are there for those who know to look. He couldn't deny it. I've stayed longer than I intended already. Because of Jenkins or the Garretts? Both, neither. He set his cleaned revolver aside. I don't stay in one place long, Mrs. Dalton. Never have since the war. Eleanor, she corrected gently. After a month of sharing our home, I think you can use my given name. He acknowledged this with a slight nod. Eleanor, then. And will you tell me why you don't stay in one place? She persisted. The real reason? Yates was silent for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. During the war, he finally said, I learned that I'm good at certain things: tracking, shooting, surviving. But those skills came with a cost. I saw and did things that changed me. Changed you how? He met her gaze directly. Made me dangerous to be around, made it safer for everyone if I kept moving, kept my distance. Eleanor didn't look away. And yet here you are, protecting us rather than endangering us. For now, he conceded. But trouble follows men like me, Eleanor, always has. Or perhaps, she suggested quietly, you follow trouble because you don't believe you deserve peace. The observation struck too close to home, making him uncomfortable. He stood abruptly. It's getting late. We should both get some rest. Eleanor rose as well, but instead of going inside, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. Whatever you decide, Yates, know that you have a home here if you want it. Not just for 2 weeks or a month, for as long as you choose. Before he could respond, she stepped back inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the vast, star-filled sky that had been his only constant companion for years. The following week passed in a tense anticipation of Jenkins's return. Yates increased security measures around the ranch, establishing regular patrols, teaching the Daltons recognition signals, insisting on armed escorts for Eleanor whenever she needed to travel to town for supplies. James threw himself into preparations for winter, ensuring adequate hay storage for their horses and reinforcing the cabin against the cold months ahead. Eleanor continued her work with the breeding program, showing a natural intuition for matching bloodlines and temperaments. On the morning Jenkins was expected to return, Yates rose before dawn and rode the perimeter of the Dalton property, checking for any signs of intruders or surveillance. Finding nothing concerning, he returned to find Eleanor in the kitchen preparing breakfast, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder. Everything quiet? She asked, handing him a cup of coffee. For now, he confirmed, accepting the cup gratefully. Where's James? Still sleeping. He was up late working on legal documents for the Tanner family. She hesitated, then added, I heard you packing last night. Yates didn't deny it. If things go well with Jenkins today, I'll be leaving tomorrow. Eleanor's hands stilled momentarily before she resumed her cooking. I see. And if things don't go well, then I'll stay until they do, she nodded, not looking at him. Where will you go? North, probably. Idaho Territory. I hear they need experienced men for the spring cattle drives. That's months away, she observed. I'll find work along the way, always do. Eleanor finally turned to face him, wiping her hands on her apron. I wish you wouldn't go, Yates, not yet. The simplicity of her statement, the genuine regret in her voice, made something shift uncomfortably in his chest. It's better this way, he said quietly. Better for whom? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the window, they could see not just Jenkins and his usual men, but a group of at least 10 riders approaching the ranch. Wake James, Yates instructed, reaching for his rifle. Tell him to come out armed but calm. Eleanor hurried to obey while Yates stepped onto the porch, positioning himself strategically to observe the approaching group. Among Jenkins's usual men, he recognized several known troublemakers from the cattle faction. The situation had escalated beyond a simple follow-up conversation. James joined him moments later, buckling his gun belt. That's quite a delegation Jenkins has brought. Show of force, Yates assessed. He's trying to intimidate you. The riders halted at the fence line, spreading out in a half-circle formation that made Yates distinctly uneasy. Jenkins dismounted, followed by several others, and approached the house. Morning, Dalton, Jenkins called, his tone falsely cordial, brought some friends to discuss our arrangement. James stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. Good morning, Mr. Jenkins. Quite a large group for a simple conversation. Jenkins smiled without warmth. These are difficult times, safety in numbers. Eleanor emerged from the house, standing slightly behind her husband. Jenkins nodded to her. Mrs. Dalton, have you and your men had breakfast, Mr. Jenkins? She asked politely, though her hand rested near the small derringer Yates knew she kept in her pocket. I could put on more coffee. Kind offer, madam, but this won't take long. Jenkins turned his attention back to James. Have you reconsidered your position on our valley's current difficulties? James cleared his throat. My wife and I have discussed the matter at length. We understand your concerns about protecting traditional grazing rights. And, Jenkins pressed. And we're open to cooperation that benefits all parties in the valley, James replied carefully. However, our primary focus must remain on establishing our horse breeding operation. Jenkins's expression hardened. That's not quite the answer I was hoping for, Dalton. It's the answer you're getting, Yates interjected, stepping forward. The Daltons have been clear about their position. One of Jenkins's men, a wiry individual with a pockmarked face, spat on the ground. Who asked you, Drifter? This is between legitimate ranchers. Walt, that's enough, Jenkins said sharply, though his eyes remained fixed on James. Perhaps I haven't made myself clear, Dalton. This isn't a request. The sheepmen are organizing. They've brought in hired guns from California. If we don't present a united front, they'll pick us off one by one. I understand your concern, James replied steadily, but involving ourselves in violence won't solve the underlying land disputes. Sometimes violence is the only language people understand, Jenkins countered. Eleanor stepped forward. Mr. Jenkins, surely there's a legal solution. My husband is skilled in property law. Perhaps he could help negotiate. Jenkins cut her off with a dismissive gesture. With respect, Mrs. Dalton, legal papers mean nothing out here when men are willing to die for what they believe is theirs. The tension was building palpably. Yates noticed Jenkins's men subtly shifting positions, hands drifting closer to their weapons. He adjusted his own stance in response, preparing for trouble. I'll make this simple, Jenkins continued. Either you're with us or you're against us. There's no middle ground anymore. James stood his ground. We won't be forced to take sides in a conflict that isn't ours, Mr. Jenkins. We came here to build something, not to destroy. Jenkins's face darkened. Then you leave us no choice but to. His words were cut off by the sound of a rifle shot from the direction of the road. Everyone froze, then turned to see a group of riders approaching rapidly from the east, not the sheepmen Jenkins feared, but a different threat entirely. Garrett's, Yates muttered, recognizing Wade's distinctive lightning bolt scar even at this distance. Everyone inside, now. What the hell? Jenkins exclaimed as the newcomers drew closer, clearly intent on violence. Old enemies, James explained quickly. They've come for us, not you. The Garrett brothers and their companions, 6 in total, slowed their approach as they realized the Dalton ranch was already occupied by a large group. Wade Garrett raised his rifle, calling out, "Dalton, we've come to settle accounts." Jenkins turned to James, comprehension dawning. "These the men who attacked you and your wife months back," James nodded grimly. "They escaped jail in Silver Creek, been expecting them." Something shifted in Jenkins's expression, a grudging respect, perhaps, for the complications the Daltons faced. Well, they picked a poor time to call. To Yates's surprise, Jenkins signaled to his men, who spread out in defensive positions. "We'll discuss our differences later, Dalton. Right now, it seems we have common enemies." The unexpected alliance formed in seconds. Eleanor and James retreated to the relative safety of the porch, while Yates, Jenkins, and the cattle ranchers prepared to confront the approaching outlaws. "Garrett," Yates called, "turn around and ride out. This doesn't need to end in bloodshed." Wade Garrett laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the distance. "Hawkins, should have known you'd still be hanging around, developing a taste for domesticity." His eyes shifted to Eleanor on the porch, or perhaps just a taste for another man's wife. Beside Yates, Jenkins muttered, "Charming fellows." "You have no idea," Yates replied grimly. Caleb Garrett nudged his horse forward. "We came for what we're owed, Dalton, your life for our brothers." James stepped to the edge of the porch. "Your brother died because he tried to murder me and assault my wife. Leave now, or you'll meet the same fate." The Garretts and their men spread out, clearly preparing to attack despite being outnumbered. Yates recognized the look in their eyes, the blind rage that made men reckless, dangerous, and unpredictable. "Last chance, Garrett," Yates warned. "Ride away." Wade's response was a bullet that whizzed past Yates's head, embedding itself in the porch post behind him. The battle erupted instantly, both sides firing as they sought cover. Eleanor pulled James back into the doorway as bullets splintered wood around them. Yates rolled behind a water trough, returning fire with calculated precision. 2 of Jenkins's men were hit in the opening volley, one crying out as a bullet tore through his shoulder. The Garretts had the disadvantage of being on horseback, presenting larger targets. One of their companions fell immediately, shot from his saddle by Jenkins himself. Another took a bullet to the leg but managed to dismount and find cover behind their horses. Caleb Garrett made a reckless charge toward the house, clearly intent on reaching James. Yates tracked him with his rifle, waiting for the clean shot that came when Caleb's horse stumbled slightly. He squeezed the trigger and Caleb tumbled from the saddle, dead before he hit the ground. "Brother!" Wade's anguished cry cut through the gunfire. His face contorted with rage, he focused all his attention on Yates, firing repeatedly and forcing the cowboy to duck behind the trough as bullets sent water spraying around him. The gunfight lasted less than 10 minutes, but seemed to stretch for hours. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the Garretts' men were dead, 1 wounded and surrendering. Wade himself had taken a bullet to the side but remained upright, his gun trained on the water trough where Yates sheltered. "Hawkins," he shouted, blood darkening his shirt. "Face me like a man." Yates met Eleanor's eyes across the yard. She had emerged from the house with a shotgun, positioned to cover him if he moved. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, then called back to Wade. "It's over, Garrett. Your brother's dead. Your men are down. Surrender now and you might live to see another sunrise." Wade's laugh was tinged with madness and pain. "Not a chance in hell. You think I came all this way to surrender? I came to watch Dalton die, to take his woman, to burn everything he built to the ground." Jenkins, who had taken cover behind a hitching post, shouted, "That's not happening today, mister. Best drop your weapon before you join your friends in the dirt." Wade's eyes darted between his adversaries, calculating his options. Then, with the desperation of a dying man with nothing to lose, he lunged toward Eleanor, firing wildly. James threw himself in front of his wife, but Yates was faster. He rose from behind the trough, firing 3 rapid shots that caught Wade in the chest. The outlaw stumbled, his expression almost surprised as he fell backward into the dust. For a moment, everyone remained frozen, processing what had happened. Then Jenkins moved to secure the surviving Garrett man while his ranch hands checked their wounded companions. Yates approached Wade's body cautiously, kicking away his gun before confirming he was dead. "It's done," he said, looking up at James and Eleanor. "They won't trouble you again." Eleanor lowered her shotgun, her hands shaking slightly but her expression resolute. James put his arm around her, holding her close as the reality of their narrow escape sank in. Jenkins approached them, his earlier hostility replaced by a grudging respect. "That was good shooting, Hawkins," he turned to James. "And good friends you've made, Dalton." Man who inspires such loyalty must have something worth following. James extended his hand. "Thank you for standing with us, Jenkins. We may not agree on everything, but I'm grateful you chose to help when it mattered." Jenkins accepted the handshake. "Way I see it, we're all trying to build something out here. Different visions, maybe, but the same goal." He glanced at the dead Garretts. "And men like that, men who only want to destroy, they're the real enemy." "Does this mean you're reconsidering your ultimatum?" Eleanor asked carefully. Jenkins sighed, looking suddenly tired. "Let's say I'm willing to give neutrality a chance, for now," he nodded toward James. "And maybe there's something to this legal approach you mentioned. Might be worth discussing after we take care of this mess." As Jenkins's men gathered their wounded and prepared to transport the dead Garretts into town for the sheriff, Yates found himself standing apart, watching the Daltons as they moved among the defenders, offering water and thanks. They had survived, not just survived, but potentially turned an enemy into an ally. The Garrett threat was eliminated, the immediate crisis had passed. There was no longer any reason for him to stay. Yet as he observed Eleanor's quiet strength as she bandaged a wounded man's arm, and James's natural leadership as he coordinated with Jenkins, Yates felt an unfamiliar reluctance to leave. These people had come to matter to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Their home had become, in some small measure, his home as well. Later that evening, after the dead had been taken to town and statements given to the sheriff, the 3 of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Eleanor had insisted on preparing a proper meal despite the day's trauma, "because we're alive, and that deserves celebration," she had declared. "Jenkins seems genuinely interested in your legal approach to the grazing disputes," Yates observed, sipping the coffee Eleanor had pressed into his hands. James nodded thoughtfully. "It won't be easy, these conflicts have deep roots, but if we can get both sides talking instead of shooting, it's a start." "You've made quite an impression on him," Yates continued. "Not many newcomers earn Graham Jenkins's respect so quickly." "I think we have you to thank for that," Eleanor said quietly. "Your presence here today made all the difference." Yates shook his head. "The Garretts would have found you eventually, with or without me." "Perhaps," James acknowledged, "but the outcome might have been very different." He hesitated, then added, "Eleanor tells me you were planning to leave tomorrow." Yates glanced at Eleanor, who met his gaze steadily. "That was the plan," he confirmed. "And now," she asked, the question hanging between them like a fragile thing that might shatter if handled roughly. Yates looked out across the land. The Daltons were transforming through sheer will and hard work the corrals holding horses with promising bloodlines. The barn he had helped build, the beginnings of irrigation ditches that would bring water to future pastures. Beyond that, the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, their peaks still touched with the day's last light. "Now," he said slowly, "I'm reconsidering." Eleanor's eyes brightened with hope. "Reconsidering in what way?" He turned to face them both. "You mentioned once that you could use a partner, someone who knows horses, who could help build this place into something substantial." James leaned forward. "Are you saying you'd consider staying, not just for a few more weeks, but as a partner in the ranch?" "If the offer still stands," Yates replied cautiously. "It more than stands," James said eagerly. "Eleanor and I have discussed it many times. You bring skills and knowledge we desperately need." "It wouldn't be easy," Yates warned. "I've been on my own a long time, not used to putting down roots." Eleanor smiled gently. Perhaps it's time to try. Not everything from the past needs to define the future, Yates. Her words echoed their earlier conversation, reminding him of possibilities he had long denied himself. He thought of the solitary path he had traveled since the war, the endless horizon always beckoning, always promising something just beyond reach that never materialized. "I can't promise forever," he said honestly, "but I can promise to stay through winter, to help build what you've started here. After that, we'll see." It was more commitment than he had given anyone in years. From the expressions on their faces, the Daltons understood exactly what it had cost him to offer even that much. "Winter's a good start," James said, extending his hand. "Partners." Yates took it, feeling the strange sensation of invisible walls beginning to crumble around him. "Partners." Eleanor's smile was radiant in the fading light. "Then I propose a toast." She raised her coffee cup. "To Dalton and Hawkins Horse Ranch, may it stand for generations." The men raised their cups in response, and Yates found himself smiling, a genuine expression that felt unfamiliar on his face after so many years of careful neutrality. As darkness settled over Pleasant Valley, bringing with it the first stars of evening, he allowed himself to consider that perhaps Eleanor was right. Perhaps the past didn't have to define the future. Perhaps even for a man like him, there could be new beginnings. Winter in Pleasant Valley brought snow to the higher elevations and cold, clear days to the ranch. The barn Yates had helped build proved sturdy against the winter winds, providing warm shelter for the horses and a workspace where James and Yates spent hours discussing breeding strategies and training techniques. Eleanor transformed the cabin into a true home, adding touches that reflected their growing prosperity: better furniture, colorful quilts, bookshelves filled with volumes on horse breeding alongside her beloved novels. She had planted a winter garden protected by glass frames Yates had helped construct, ensuring fresh vegetables even as snow dusted the surrounding hills. The promised partnership flourished as each brought their unique strengths to the enterprise. James's legal mind handled contracts and negotiations. Eleanor's organizational skills and intuitive understanding of bloodlines guided their breeding program. Yates's practical experience with horses and ranch operations filled gaps in their knowledge that books alone couldn't provide. Word spread about the quality of their stock. Ranchers from as far as Prescott came to discuss purchasing foals from their spring breeding. Even Jenkins, true to his word about reconsidering his approach to the valley's conflicts, brought potential buyers from his cattle association. As December gave way to January, and then February, Yates found himself thinking less about leaving and more about the next season's projects: expanding the corral system, adding a training ring, bringing in new bloodlines from California. On a crisp February evening, as a rare snowfall dusted the valley, the three of them sat in the warmth of the cabin. Eleanor was mending a shirt while James reviewed breeding records. Yates had been cleaning his saddle by the fire, thinking about the string of 2-year-olds they would begin training in spring. "I've been corresponding with a breeder in Kentucky," James mentioned, looking up from his papers. "He has a stallion with impressive racing lines he's willing to sell. Might be worth considering for our program." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "Racing blood could strengthen our stock, especially crossed with the Spanish mares we have. It would mean one of us traveling east to evaluate the horse," Eleanor pointed out, setting aside her mending. "We can't purchase sight unseen, not for that kind of investment." James glanced at Yates. "I was thinking you might go come April. You know more about conformation than either of us." The suggestion caught Yates by surprise, not just the trip itself, but the implicit understanding that he would return afterward. "That's 2 months away," he said carefully. "I only promised to stay through winter." A brief silence fell over the room. Eleanor's hands stilled on her mending, though her expression remained composed. James set down his papers, meeting Yates's gaze directly. "So you have," he acknowledged, "and you've more than fulfilled that promise." He hesitated, then added, "We had hoped you might consider extending your stay." "The partnership has been profitable for all of us, I think." Yates couldn't deny the truth of that statement. His share of the winter sales had given him more money than he typically earned in 6 months of drifting. "It's not about the profit," he said honestly. "Then what is it about?" Eleanor asked quietly. Yates set aside the saddle, gathering his thoughts. "I told you once that trouble follows men like me. And I told you that perhaps you follow trouble because you don't believe you deserve peace," Eleanor countered. "The Garretts proved my point, not yours," he reminded her. James leaned forward. "The Garretts would have found us with or without your presence, Yates, and they're gone now. That chapter is closed." "There are always more Garretts," Yates said grimly. "More men who want what others have built. And we'll face them together if they come," Eleanor insisted. "Just as we did before." Yates looked between them, these two people who had somehow breached the walls he had built around himself. "You don't understand what you're asking, the life I've led, the things I've done." "We're not asking for your past," James said gently. "We're asking for your future." The simple statement struck Yates with unexpected force. In all his years of wandering, no one had ever asked for his future, only his gun, his skills, his temporary loyalty. No one had ever looked at him and seen something worth keeping. "I don't know if I have a future to give," he admitted quietly. "I've lived so long in the present, one day to the next." Eleanor rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside him, her eyes earnest in the firelight. "Then build one with us, Yates, day by day, if that's what it takes." Something shifted within him, a door long closed beginning to open to possibilities he had denied himself for years. He thought of the life he had led since the war, the endless horizons that had beckoned him onward without ever offering what he truly sought, not just peace, but belonging. "I can't promise forever," he said again, echoing his words from months earlier. "But I can promise to try." It wasn't the complete commitment they might have hoped for, but from the way their faces brightened, they understood what it had cost him to offer even that much. "That's all any of us can do," James said warmly. "Try each day to build something worthwhile." Eleanor impulsively took Yates's hand between both of hers. "So you'll go to Kentucky in April and come back to us." The touch of her hands, warm, steady, unafraid, grounded him in the moment. "Yes," he said. "I'll go, and I'll come back." The smile that illuminated her face was worth any uncertainty the future might hold. Spring arrived in Pleasant Valley with an explosion of wildflowers across the hills and new foals in the corral. The day before Yates was to leave for Kentucky, Eleanor insisted on a proper dinner to mark the occasion. "It's not a farewell," she declared as she prepared a roast and her special apple pie. "It's a safe journey and swift return celebration." Yates had packed lightly for the trip, taking only what he would need for the weeks of travel. Unlike previous journeys, he left most of his belongings behind: his books, his better clothes, the silver-framed mirror Eleanor had given him at Christmas. Small anchors tying him to this place, to these people who had become more important to him than he had ever intended. As they sat down to dinner, James raised his glass. "To successful negotiations and safe travels." "And to coming home," Eleanor added softly, her eyes meeting Yates's across the table. Home. The word resonated within him with unexpected power. He had not had a home since before the war, only places he stayed, temporary shelters against the elements. Yet somehow, without his noticing, this ranch had become home. These people had become, not quite family, but something equally essential. "I'll be back within the month," he promised. "Sooner if the stallion isn't what we hope." "Take whatever time you need to make the right decision," James advised. "This purchase could shape our breeding program for years to come." After dinner, as Eleanor cleared the dishes, James handed Yates an envelope. "Bank draft for the purchase if the horse meets our requirements." And he hesitated, then added a second envelope. "This is a letter authorizing you to act as full partner in all negotiations. It's been officially registered with the county clerk." Yates accepted both envelopes, understanding the trust they represented. "I'll handle it as if it were my own investment." "It is your own investment," James reminded him. "That's what partnership means." Later, as darkness fell, Yates found himself on the porch, gazing at the stars and thinking about the journey ahead. The sound of the door opening signaled Eleanor's approach before her footsteps did. "Can't sleep?" she asked, joining him at the railing. Just thinking, he replied. Been a while since I traveled east, she nodded, her profile silvered by moonlight. Will you visit your home in Massachusetts? Nothing there to visit anymore, he said quietly. No family, no friends who'd remember me. I'm sorry, she said, and he knew she meant it. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the night sounds, an owl calling from the nearby trees, the soft nickering of horses in the corral. Yates, Eleanor finally said, her voice hesitant in a way it rarely was, there's something I need to say before you go. He turned to look at her, struck again by the quiet strength in her features, the determination that had carried her through hardship without breaking her spirit. When I rode into Silver Creek that day, she continued, half dead from heat and fear, I had one thought keeping me going, that James needed me to be strong to find help. She met his gaze directly. I never expected to find someone like you. Someone who would not only save James, but who would become so essential to both of us. Eleanor, she held up a hand to stop him. Please let me finish. I know you still think of yourself as temporary here despite everything. I know you believe your past somehow disqualifies you from the future you deserve. She took a deep breath. But I want you to know that whatever you decide when you return from Kentucky, whether you stay another season or another decade, you have brought something irreplaceable into our lives. And we are better for having known you. The unexpected declaration left him momentarily speechless. In all his years of wandering, no one had ever spoken to him with such sincerity about his worth beyond his skills with horses and guns. I'm not good with words like you and James, he finally said, but I want you to know that whatever good I've brought to your lives, you've returned tenfold to mine. She smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Then come back to us, Yates, not because of the horses or the ranch or the profit. Come back because this is where you belong now. Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, a gesture of affection that contained no demands, only acceptance. Then she turned and went back into the house, leaving him with the lingering warmth of her touch and the certainty that, for perhaps the first time since the war, he had found something worth returning to. The journey east proved longer than anticipated. Spring storms delayed trains and flooded roads, turning what should have been a 3-week trip into nearly 6 weeks of frustration. The Kentucky stallion, however, proved worth the effort, a magnificent bay with impeccable bloodlines and the temperament they had hoped for. As Yates finally headed west again, the stallion and 2 additional mares he had purchased secured in a special train car, he found himself increasingly eager to return to Pleasant Valley. The eastern cities had felt suffocating after so long in the open spaces of Arizona territory. The formality of Kentucky horse society had reminded him why he had left such structured environments behind. He sent telegrams when possible, keeping James and Eleanor informed of his progress and purchases. Their replies had been brief but warm, expressing their trust in his judgment and their anticipation of his return. It was early June when he finally approached the familiar outline of the Dalton ranch. The valley was lush with late spring growth, the surrounding hills still green from winter rains. As he rode up the long drive leading to the house, Yates noted with approval the improvements that had been made in his absence, new fencing along the eastern pasture. The training ring he had designed before leaving now complete, a fresh coat of paint on the barn. He was still 100 yards from the house when the door flew open and Eleanor rushed out, James close behind her. Their faces lit with genuine joy at the sight of him, erasing any lingering doubts he might have harbored about his place in their lives. Yates, Eleanor called, waving eagerly. Welcome home, home. The word settled around his shoulders like a comfortable blanket, warming places within him that had been cold for too many years. As he dismounted, Eleanor surprised him with an impulsive hug while James gripped his shoulder warmly. They bombarded him with questions about his journey, the horses he had purchased, the developments in Eastern breeding techniques. You must be exhausted, Eleanor finally said, taking in his trail-worn appearance. I'll heat water for a bath while you get settled. As she hurried inside, James helped Yates unsaddle his horse. The stallion and mares, he asked eagerly, arriving by wagon tomorrow, left them in town to rest from the journey. Yates stretched his stiff back. Worth every dollar and minute, though. Wait until you see them. James nodded, then hesitated before adding, we were starting to worry when weeks passed without word. Telegraph lines were down after the storms, Yates explained. Sent messages when I could, I know, it's just… James searched for the right words. Things haven't been quite the same without you here. The simple statement, offered without embellishment, touched Yates more deeply than he expected. Miss this place too, he admitted. More than I anticipated, James smiled. Good. Because we've been planning expansions that require your input. Eleanor has ideas about breeding that need your practical perspective. As they walked toward the house, Yates felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. The smell of Eleanor's cooking wafted from the open door. The sound of horses nickering in the corral welcomed him. The mountains stood sentinel against the sky, unchanged and enduring. Inside, the cabin had been transformed in subtle ways that spoke of prosperity and permanence. New curtains at the windows, a better table in the kitchen, shelves lined with books on horse breeding and ranch management. Your room's just as you left it, Eleanor called from the kitchen. Though I did add a new quilt for the warmer weather. His room. Not a guest room or temporary quarters, but his room, another small anchor tying him to this place. Over supper, Yates shared stories from his journey while James and Eleanor updated him on ranch developments in his absence. New foals had been born. Jenkins had brought potential buyers from as far as California. The legal approach to the grazing disputes was gaining traction, with James now recognized as a mediator between competing interests. And no trouble, Yates asked, the old wariness surfacing briefly. No unwelcome visitors, James shook his head. Peaceful as can be, the Garrett's death sent a message that seems to have been received by others of their kind. Later, as darkness fell and James excused himself to review some papers before bed, Yates and Eleanor found themselves alone on the porch, just as they had been the night before his departure. I kept every telegram, she admitted, her voice soft in the evening stillness. Even the ones that just said delayed in St. Louis or stallion purchased, details follow. Yates smiled slightly. Wasn't much of a correspondent, was I? You said what needed saying, she replied, and you came back, that's what matters. He turned to look at her, struck anew by the quiet strength in her face, the determination that had carried her across a desert to save her husband, across a continent to build a new life. I want to stay, he said simply, not just for another season, for good. The joy that illuminated her face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I was hoping you'd say that. It won't always be easy, he cautioned. I'm set in my ways, been alone a long time. You're not alone anymore, she reminded him gently. And as for ways, mine and James's weren't exactly aligned when we first married. We learned to complement each other rather than clash, she smiled. We'll do the same with you. The promise in her words of patience, of acceptance, of enduring connection offered him something he had not dared hope for in all his years of wandering, a future with meaning beyond survival. There's something I need to tell you, he said slowly. Something about my past that you and James should know if I'm to stay permanently. Eleanor's expression grew serious. Whatever it is, Yates, it won't change how we feel about you now. He took a deep breath, preparing to share the burden he had carried alone for so many years. During the war, I wasn't just a soldier. After Gettysburg, I was recruited for special assignments tracking deserters, gathering intelligence behind enemy lines sometimes. He hesitated, then continued, sometimes eliminating specific threats without the formality of battle. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You were more than a scout, you were an assassin. He nodded grimly. The skills that made me valuable then are the same ones that have kept me moving since the war, the ability to track, to hunt, to kill without hesitation when necessary. Like with the Garretts, she said quietly. Yes, it comes too easily to me, Eleanor. That's why I never stay in one place long, why I never allow myself to form attachments. He met her gaze directly. People around me tend to become targets for those I've crossed. Eleanor considered his words carefully before responding. The war asked terrible things of many men, Yates, turned farmers into killers, scholars into strategists, boys into broken men. She placed her hand gently on his arm, but the war ended. Those choices were made in a time and place that no longer exists. The skills remain, he reminded her, the instincts, the capacity for violence. Yes, she acknowledged, and thank God they do, or James and I might not be alive today. Her voice strengthened with conviction. Your past shaped you, Yates, but it doesn't define you, not unless you let it. He studied her face, searching for any sign of fear or judgment and finding only compassion and understanding. James should know, he said finally, before he agrees to a permanent partnership. Then tell him tomorrow, she replied simply. He'll say what I've said, that who you were during the war matters less than who you choose to be now. The certainty in her voice, the unwavering acceptance she offered, eased something that had been tightly coiled within him for years. Here, in this unlikely place, with these extraordinary people, he had found not just a home but a chance at redemption, an opportunity to use his skills to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing more in me than I saw in myself. Eleanor smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight above them. That's what family does, Yates, sees the best in each other, even when we can't see it ourselves. Family, the word resonated within him, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. As they stood together in the peaceful darkness, the future stretching before them like the vast Arizona sky, Yates Hawkins finally allowed himself to believe that his wandering days were over. That here, on this ranch, with these people who had become essential to him, he had found not just a place to stay, but a place to belong. The years that followed proved Eleanor right. James had accepted Yates's revelation about his wartime activities with the same understanding she had shown, recognizing that the skills that made him dangerous also made him invaluable as a protector and partner. Together, the three of them built the Dalton and Hawkins Horse Ranch into one of the most respected breeding operations in the territory. Their horses, known for intelligence, endurance, and sound conformation, commanded premium prices from buyers throughout the West. The Pleasant Valley feud eventually resolved, due in no small part to James's legal mediation and the example set by their neutral but prosperous ranch. Graham Jenkins became an unlikely ally. His initial hostility transformed into respectful collaboration as they worked together to establish fair grazing practices that benefited both cattle and sheep interests. Yates never lost his vigilance, his habit of scanning horizons, of noticing strangers, of maintaining his shooting skills, but the constant wariness that had driven him from place to place gradually eased. He came to recognize that his past, with all its darkness, had prepared him to appreciate the light he had found in Pleasant Valley. On a summer evening 5 years after his return from Kentucky, Yates sat on the expanded porch of what was now a substantial ranch house, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Eleanor joined him, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. James says the new foal is doing well, she reported, handing him a glass. Mare too, Yates nodded, satisfied. That bloodline's proving its worth. Strong offspring, good temperaments. They sat in companionable silence, watching as the day's last light touched the mountains. In the distance, they could see the outbuildings of their expanded operation, a larger barn, additional corrals, bunkhouses for the ranch hands they now employed, even a small schoolhouse for the children of their workers. Do you ever miss it? Eleanor asked suddenly. The traveling. The freedom of answering to no one. Yates considered the question thoughtfully. Sometimes I miss the simplicity, he admitted, just me and a horse and the horizon. He turned to look at her. But I've found something better here, something worth staying for. She smiled, her face still beautiful though now marked with fine lines that spoke of years lived fully, with both joy and sorrow. No regrets then? None, he assured her, though I still don't understand why you and James took such a chance on a wandering gunman with a shadowed past. Eleanor's expression grew reflective. I knew from the moment you walked into that Silver Creek saloon when I whispered that James was still out there and you said he'd answer to you. She reached over to take his hand. "I knew then that you were a man of honor beneath all that hardness. A man who would risk his life for strangers because it was the right thing to do. Or perhaps just a man who didn't know any better," he suggested with a trace of humor. She shook her head firmly. "A man who, despite everything he'd seen and done, still believed in justice. Still cared enough to act when others would have looked away." She squeezed his hand. "That's the man we believed in then, that's the man we know now." From inside the house came the sound of James's laughter, followed by the excited voices of the young ranch hands who had stayed for dinner to discuss breeding plans for the coming season. The evening breeze carried the scent of Eleanor's roses, planted along the front walkway and now in full summer bloom. As darkness settled over Pleasant Valley, bringing with it the first stars of evening, Yates Hawkins felt the profound rightness of his place in this world they had built together. Not as a drifter passing through, not as a hired gun, but as an essential part of something enduring and worthwhile. Lena rose to go inside, pausing to rest her hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture of affection that had become familiar and cherished over the years. "Coming in." "In a minute," he replied. "Just want to watch the stars come out." She nodded understanding and went inside, leaving him with his thoughts and the vast Arizona sky that had once been his only constant companion. Yates leaned back in his chair, remembering that long-ago day when a desperate woman had staggered into a saloon, whispering that her husband was still out there. Remembering his own voice, steady and certain, promising that her husband would answer to him. He couldn't have known then how those words would change his life, how they would lead him not just to a rescue mission, but to redemption. To home. To family. The first star appeared above the mountains, bright against the deepening blue. Yates raised his glass in a silent toast to the journey that had brought him here, to this place where his past no longer defined his future. Where the skills forged in war now protected what he loved. Where the man he had been had become the man he was meant to be. As the stars multiplied across the sky, Yates Hawkins, once a wanderer without roots, now a man firmly planted in the soil of Pleasant Valley, finally rose to join his family inside, grateful for the chance meeting, the desperate whisper and the promise that had changed everything.